Walter Lippmann, Public Opinion. Uncover the hidden forces shaping public perception. It can be tricky to imagine what life was like without the kind of mass media that surrounds us today. Never mind the internet, what about the times before television, radio, or international newspapers? In 1922, Walter Lippmann was already trying to grapple with the effects that modern technology, as well as the changing and expanding socio-political landscape, were having on people. In his introduction, he uses a story of English, French, and German people living harmoniously on an island in 1914, unaware that war among their respective nations has broken out. Cut off from radio and newspapers, they had no one to tell them that their neighbors were supposed to be their enemies. He uses this as an example of how, unlike the people on the island, we live in a pseudo-environment. Rather than directly experiencing the world, we instead react to a pseudo-environment that is populated by media, culture, and past experiences that can, in fact, distort reality. If this all sounds rather heady, well, it kind of is. But fear not. In the sections ahead, we'll break down Lippmann's ideas and explain why this 100-year-old book is still highly relevant today. Barriers to reality. Let's start by acknowledging that we're all individuals, and yet we're all part of a larger society that involves government, corporations, and mass media. This sounds simple enough, and yet these basic facts come with a whole host of factors that shape how we perceive and understand the external world. Let's start by looking at some of the various barriers we put in place that prevent individuals from accurately grasping the complexities of reality. Keep in mind that what we'll be looking at is how these barriers also play a role in shaping public opinion about important topics that affect everyone. One of the more obvious barriers is censorship. The truth is that every community tends to establish some rules about what is acceptable to express. In fact, you can say that it's a natural outcome of the human tendency to use censorship to avoid uncomfortable truths and protect personal privacy. But this self-censorship leads to a selective presentation of facts in which individuals and groups choose what information to share or withhold based on their interests. The author uses the example of war censorship, in which governments restrict certain information to maintain morale. Individuals also engage in similar practices in their daily lives, filtering out information that challenges their worldview. But those worldviews can also be limited by a lack of direct contact with what's going on outside their immediate experience. This, too, can affect people's understanding of reality. Most people haven't traveled very far from home, and they're used to talking to people of a similar cultural background. So they get their information about distant events and issues from second-hand sources, whether it's news reports, rumors, or the opinions of others. This indirect contact is the information that comes to form their own views and opinions, and it often leads to distorted or incomplete perceptions. Other factors are time and attention, and the lack thereof. Even when information is available, individuals have limited time and cognitive resources to process it. This leads to a reliance on shortcuts that can oversimplify complex realities. This is also what leads people to gravitate towards stereotypes. Even newspapers must condense lengthy events into brief articles that capture readers' attention. The need to fit information into short, digestible pieces means that much of the nuance and context are lost, contributing to a superficial understanding of issues. This is just the tip of the iceberg, so to speak. In the sections ahead, we'll look closer at how our distorted worldview can lead to harmful public opinions and the different ways in which this can be exploited. The shortcut of stereotypes. In the previous section, we briefly mentioned how incomplete or distorted information can lead to people latching on to stereotypes and believing they're true. This was a big concern in the author's time, and it continues to be highly relevant today. Stereotypes are essentially mental shortcuts or simplified images that people use to make sense of the world. In some ways, they can be useful. Since reality is full of grey areas and complexities, individuals rely on these simplified images to navigate life. They can act as a framework through which people interpret new information, helping them quickly categorize and respond to their environments. But they can also be harmful. People from different cultures often have stereotyped views of each other, such as seeing foreigners as either exotic or threatening, based on their limited experience and media portrayals. While stereotypes help manage complexity, they can also distort reality by oversimplifying and generalizing diverse groups or situations. Stereotypes can also function as a defense mechanism, helping individuals avoid the discomfort of confronting unfamiliar or contradictory information. For example, people may cling to nationalistic stereotypes during times of war, reinforcing their sense of identity and righteousness, even if these stereotypes are inaccurate or harmful. Ultimately, this defensive use of stereotypes can lead to resistance to change and a reluctance to challenge one's own beliefs. Now, having cultural blind spots and adhering to certain social codes are very natural parts of being human, but they can also result in discrimination and lead to much more harmful effects on societies, for no other reason than ignorance and a distorted worldview. Stereotypes should be managed and mitigated through conscious effort, such as education and exposure to diverse perspectives. The interests of the masses. What are you interested in? This is an important question because our interests have a lot to do with the kind of information we decide to expose ourselves to, and they thus influence our opinions. But our interest will also dictate how others will go about trying to influence our opinion. Let's face it, humans aren't purely rational beings who form opinions based solely on facts and logical arguments. Instead, our opinions are deeply intertwined with our personal interests. These interests, be they economic, social, or emotional, guide our attention, shape our perceptions, and influence how we interpret information. Politicians, corporations, and advertisers understand this dynamic well and often appeal to people's interests to garner support or influence public behavior. For example, during election campaigns, candidates may focus on issues that directly affect voters' livelihoods, such as taxes or job creation, knowing that these issues will resonate with their self-interest. That's why appealing to people's interests is often a more powerful tool in the formation of public opinion than making logical arguments. There's also a history of individual interests being transferred to collective concerns. One of the best examples of this is a labor union, where workers with varied personal concerns come together around shared economic interests, such as better wages or working conditions. But the transfer of these individual concerns to a unified movement requires deliberate organization and communication, which can be exploited. Issues must be framed in ways that resonate with the broader group, often through emotional appeals or the creation of a common enemy. This brings us to another problematic issue, which is that in making appeals to various interests, even in democratic processes, arguments are often boiled down to oversimplified, binary, yes or no decisions. This can lead to situations in which the true nature of the public's will gets distorted. For example, in elections, voters are often presented with two candidates or two policy options, but the underlying issues may be far more nuanced. This binary approach limits the ability of the public to express their full range of opinions and reduces complex debates to superficial choices. This oversimplification is a hindrance to genuine democracy, in which the diversity of public opinion should ideally be reflected in more than just a yes-no vote. Sometimes it's the leaders themselves who are doing the simplifying. For example, during wartime, political leaders may present a conflict in terms of good versus evil, reducing the complexity of international relations to a moral narrative that resonates with the public. Not all leaders are self-serving manipulators. They can also be driven by a genuine desire to serve the public good. However, the dynamic between leaders and followers can also result in a passive public that relies on the interpretations of a few rather than engaging directly with the issues. Whether in politics, business, or media, leaders set the agenda and frame the choices, while the public largely follows. This relationship creates a dependency in which the public often waits for direction, rather than actively participating in the formation of opinion. Still, leaders cannot act entirely independent of public sentiment. They must remain attuned to the interests of the masses to maintain their influence. The limits of democracy. Democracy, in theory, is built on the idea that citizens participate in governance for the common good, but in practice, it is more often influenced by individuals who are primarily concerned with their own interests. This self-centeredness can undermine democratic processes by leading individuals to prioritize personal gain over collective welfare. For example, voters might support policies that benefit their own economic position, even if those policies are detrimental to society as a whole. This self-interest can lead to a fragmented and less effective democratic system in which decisions are driven more by individual agendas than by a genuine consideration of the common good. This less effective democratic system is the result of the self-contained community. When communities are self-contained and insulated, their members are less exposed to diverse viewpoints and are more likely to cling to their own biases and stereotypes. Rural communities may have limited exposure to urban issues, and vice versa, all of which results in a skewed understanding of democratic principles as individuals lack awareness of broader societal issues and alternative perspectives. The realities of power dynamics can also undermine democratic principles, as influential groups and individuals use their position to exert control and shape public opinion. When political leaders or wealthy individuals use their resources to sway elections or public policy, it creates a system where the public good takes a back seat to the influence of a powerful, self-centered few. Democracy should be re-examined in the modern age if it is to work as it should. Democracy can be more effective and more inclusive than it is now. The workers who make up the majority should have more power and influence than the rich who make up the minority. But this is also an issue that comes with great complexity and will need serious reform before it happens. Buyer beware. Another source of outsized power and influence is the media. In the author's day, this was the newspaper, but much of what he has to say still applies to the news industry of the 21st century. For example, the question remains of how aware the average consumer is of the fact that newspapers are not just sources of information, but also commercial enterprises that cater to the interests and preferences of their readers. This means that newspapers often shape their content to attract and retain readers, emphasizing stories that appeal to their audience's tastes and biases. It's not rare for a newspaper to sensationalize news or focus on certain issues to boost circulation and advertising revenue. During election campaigns, it's common for media outlets to highlight scandalous stories to capture public attention and influence opinions, rather than providing balanced and comprehensive coverage. Even in 1922, there was, as the author puts it, the constant reader. This is the person who regularly gets news from one source. Constant readers develop a habitual relationship that shapes their understanding of current events and issues. This kind of exposure can lead to a reinforcement of existing beliefs and biases. Readers of a newspaper with a conservative or liberal bias are likely to receive a skewed perspective on political issues that may reinforce their pre-existing views rather than challenging them. Ultimately, news is not a straightforward reflection of reality, but a constructed narrative influenced by various factors, including editorial decisions, journalistic practices, and audience preferences. News stories are often selected and presented in ways that highlight certain aspects while downplaying others, creating a specific image of events. Deadlines, resource constraints, and the need to attract readers all lead to an oversimplification or distortion of complex issues. The nature of news is such that it can both inform and mislead, depending on how it is framed and presented. While newspapers have a significant impact on shaping public opinion, they often fall short of providing a complete and accurate picture of reality. Understanding the limitations of newspapers is crucial for developing a more informed and critical approach to consuming news. Readers need to be aware of the biases and constraints affecting news coverage and seek out diverse sources and perspectives to gain a fuller understanding of the truth. Changing the future. When speaking of reform or how things need to change, it can be a challenge to picture that change really happening. Can the US really change the way its democracy functions? For this reason, the author introduces the concept of the entering wedge. The entering wedge is a strategy that can be used to introduce new ideas or changes gradually. The idea is to start with a smaller, less controversial proposal that can pave the way for more significant shifts. This approach allows for incremental change without overwhelming resistance. For example, in policymaking, a government might first introduce minor reforms that are more likely to gain public support before proposing more extensive changes. This method is effective because it reduces immediate opposition while building momentum for larger initiatives. The entering wedge can be seen in various contexts, such as social movements or legislative changes, where initial small steps lead to more substantial transformations over time. But in making any positive change, those in charge need to understand the ins and outs of managing public opinion. For this, there are 3 important steps, which also serve as a recap of what we've already discussed. The first is intelligence gathering, collecting data and interpreting trends, all in order to gauge public sentiment and tailor the messages. Effective intelligence work is not just about collecting facts, but also about understanding the public's psychological and emotional responses. This brings us to the second area, appealing to the public. Successful appeals often involve addressing the public's values, emotions, and interests. Persuasive approaches, emotional appeals, and aligning with popular sentiments are all common techniques. These appeals are crafted to align with existing public attitudes or to shift them subtly. By tapping into what the public already cares about or fears, these appeals can effectively mobilize support or influence behavior. Finally, try to find the right balance of emotion and reason. Rational arguments and logical reasoning are important in shaping public opinion, even though they often play a secondary role compared to emotional and psychological appeals. Facts and statistics are still important, but for effective communication and persuasion, one needs to achieve a balance between rational discourse and emotional appeal. The main takeaway of this Blink to Public Opinion by Walter Lippmann is that people's views are often shaped by media and external sources rather than direct experiences. The idea of the pseudo-environment suggests that the world we perceive is not the real world, but a constructed version influenced by media, corporations, governments, and propaganda. This constructed reality can lead to misconceptions and misinformation. Relying on second-hand sources for our understanding of other cultures and world events also plays a big role in shaping public opinion by creating stereotypes and distorting reality. Without a better understanding of the big picture, self-interests can take over. The impact of this distorted perception is distressing, as it has a negative effect on democracy, since an informed citizenry is crucial for a healthy democratic society. Democracy is also in danger of being controlled by leaders and influential powers who simplify complex issues into yes or no questions, thereby limiting the influence of the masses. Democracy should be about the betterment of the many, not the few. The real challenge lies in whether or not we'll ever be able to manage public opinion to promote reform and positive change. Okay, that's it for this Blink. We hope you enjoyed it. If you can, please take the time to leave us a rating. We always appreciate your feedback. Thanks for listening, and see you next time.